Yeah.
Maybe a few minutes.
I don't. Well, okay, we can wait 2 minutes. Yeah, 5 past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like Ellen, what's her name? The Ellen show. Yes, the winners. Yes, no, I'm not wrong. But I'm not as funny as she is. Oh, you hear me? Then maybe I should. Of course I hear you.
Why don't you come closer? Come on, we're not that many. So, I know 3 of the 5 in the audience.
Yeah.
We can do a round of
Yeah,
introduction.
almost, yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I think we can start. Why not?
I think it's on. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this exciting book launch on a very interesting and important topic. The book comes at a timely time. It describes but also exposes political corruption in its various shapes in different countries with country case examples. The book accurately depicts how ruling elites use power to extract financial resources for individual but also group enrichment, as well as how the ruling elites use these acquired financial resources for political support, protection, and to hold on power. Many examples are provided in the book. I had the chance to read some of the chapters, and I found them very exciting. And we will hear about some of them during today's presentation. In particular, how political corruption is captured and preserved in Nigeria, Uganda, and Mozambique. We'll first have a discussion, we'll hear about the example, have a discussion with the authors, and then open the floor for questions with the audience. First, I would like to invite Inge Amundsen for some opening remark. He's the editor of the book. Inge is a senior researcher at CMI, focusing his research on political corruption and political economy. So please, if you like.
Yes, I wanted to say that I'm very happy to finally have the book in hand. It's always very fun. It's been a long journey, but I think it has been worthwhile. I have learned a lot. I think the conceptual framework has carried us through all these chapters fruitfully. As I said in the previous presentation, some of my motivation for doing this is that I think the concept of political corruption has been undercommunicated and partly misunderstood, both in academia and in practical anti-corruption work, leading some research astray, not focusing on what I think is the most important, namely political corruption, and leading a lot of anti-corruption efforts in the wrong direction towards bureaucratic corruption, which I think can be eradicated relatively easily if there is a political will to do so. And basically the donors' approaches to anti-corruption has been apolitical, very technical, addressing bureaucratic institutions mainly, and ignoring the political setup in which this takes place. So this is a modest effort to bring the discussion on the state and political corruption back into the main focus.
Thank you very much. Maybe we could start with the example in Uganda. So may I invite Moses Khisa, who has written several chapters in the book, but in particular the one on Uganda. So Moses, he's an assistant professor of political science in the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University in the US, but he's also a research associate in a research center in Uganda, and he works on comparative politics and international economy. So may I give you the floor for the example in Uganda, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for the kind introduction. And again, let me thank our colleague, Dr. Inge Amundsen, for leading this project and making it happen. And, we are here today for this book launch because of his very tireless efforts and the great, amazing work that he has done over the last couple of years that we've been working together on this project. This book is very important and timely, as Sophie said, because it does bring to the fore a very important aspect of contemporary African politics, and that is the intersection between money and politics, broadly conceived. Part of the other work that I'm doing is on campaign financing in Tanzania and Uganda. And campaign financing is very much at the heart of political corruption. In the US, what would be called corruption elsewhere is called campaign financing. It's called campaign finance donations, but it is corruption. Anyway, I share Inge's analytical and conceptual decoupling of political corruption and bureaucratic corruption. And as he rightly said, bureaucratic and administrative corruption can be fixed in a certain way. It can be technically fixed, right? Through technology, for example, you can overcome certain, loopholes and avenues through which people, engage in bribery and solicitation of financial resources. You can do that through, putting in place systems and mechanisms that stop people from using their offices for personal gain. You can also undertake measures like, better remuneration and, better training and motivation and that kind of stuff, and people will be less corrupt. But that cannot apply to another very different type of corruption, which is what we call political corruption. Because political corruption is rooted in the overall politics of a country. And this is the argument I make in the chapter on Uganda, that we have to understand the magnitude and the implications of political corruption within the context of a country's politics. And in the case of Uganda, the politics that has evolved since 1986 is politics that falls under the rubric of broad-based politics, which is, include and co-opt as many elites, as many constituent actors as possible into a broad coalition. And that broad coalition is a clientelistic broad coalition. It is a patronage client arrangement where, different individuals and whatever constituencies they represent have to benefit from the quote-unquote national cake, which is, the public purse. And so what that means is that the system is built around distributing access to resources. Now, I hope this is not a restatement of the old cliche about, African politics being big man, patronage, neo-patrimonial politics, because I think there are some countries that have kind of broken out of that straitjacket of neo-patrimonialism. But the point is that the nature of Ugandan politics under the current regime of Museveni has been such that he needs to reach out and bring on board many constituents. And the more authoritarian he has become, the more he has to rely on, illicit sources of funds, but also, allowing avenues for his supporters and his, cronies to profiteer from the system and profiteer personally, but also use those resources for purposes of, preserving the status quo through, voter bribery and funding, campaign activities of the incumbent and that kind of stuff. In the chapter on Uganda, I analyzed some of the developments in the 1990s during the time of privatization. Inge earlier on here gave us a breakdown of the different ways that political corruption leads to extraction. There is the example of embezzlement, which in Uganda happened with many of the former public parastatals, the former state-owned businesses that were basically dished out to cronies and to regime-connected, business actors. And many of those individual actors in the business sector remain very much part of the setup, part of the system. So, there is a dynamic interaction between actors in the private sector who, get, access to whether it's public parastatals or it is, government contracts. Today, especially big infrastructure contracts are sources of rent, sharing between the private sector and the public. So anyway, I not go too much into what is in the chapter. I encourage you to read the book. But in a sense, the Ugandan case is a good example of how the way the dynamics of politics and dealing with different interest groups fuels the need for political corruption to thrive, such that the system can reproduce, such that the system can thrive and survive. And it's made worse, by the way, with more competition. More political competition fuels more clientelist politics, especially where you have weak institutions, which is the case with a country like Uganda. I think I'll stop there for now. Sophie, thanks.
Thank you, and I think we'll be able to go into more details during our exchanges and discussion. There is another country case that is interesting. I think it's Mozambique. And recently we heard a lot about Mozambique with the loan case. Maybe I can invite you, Aslak Orre, to present the Mozambique. So you are a senior researcher at CMI. You focus your research on Angola and Mozambique, and in particular in relation to the political economy of oil and extractive industries in general, and corruption. So you'll be sharing some of the main findings you've found in your research with Mozambique, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And also, I would start by saying that I'm the co-author of one of the chapters in the book, together with a Mozambican lead academic and an anti-corruption campaigner, Adriano Novunga. Also happy that we were invited to take part in this book, very much so, as I'm going to come back to. I think that, as you said, Inge, the conceptual framework of the book really helped us along and give us some clues to think anew and getting a new analytical grasp on understanding Mozambican society and development. I want to start by the end, so to say. The biggest political case in Mozambique at the moment, and it has been so for the last few years, is the so-called secret debts or hidden loans case, which is, to put it shortly, it's really jeopardizing the stability of the entire state construction of Mozambique in a way. So let me just say that Mozambique is still one of the world's poorest countries. According to the UNDP's Human Development Index, it's among the 10 poorest countries in the world. And these secret loans, most of them acquired in 2013 and totaling some $2 billion US, added around 30% to the country's foreign debt. The Mozambican public had absolutely none benefit from the borrowing of these $2 billion. To the contrary, as a result of the discoveries of these secret loans and debts in early 2016, donors withdrew aid and foreign grants dropped by 72% and external loan disbursement by 87% from 2014 to 2017. Foreign direct investment dropped by 40%. The country defaulted on its debt. The country plummeted on credit ratings. The currency devalued and inflation soared. Imports of food and medicine fell, and thousands lost their jobs. And according to calculations that we have recently done in a parallel study now about the costs and consequences of the secret loans, we think that more than 2 million people were cast into or cast below the official poverty line as a direct consequence of the taking up of these loans. That's how dramatic it is. 2 million people. And why? I'll come back to that. It was a large-scale, premeditated and cynical scheme threatening the financial stability of the country. And the president, the previous president, was implicated somehow. In the end, as I said, it threatens the very stability of the country. And for what? It was driven a lot by greedy business people in the north, for one. Secondly, by equally greedy politicians in Mozambique. So it had both sides. It takes two to tango, as they say. In addition, there was this other motive of Mozambican politicians to amass wealth through corruption as a means to perpetuate the political power of the political party, Frelimo, who has been in power since 1975, and particular factions within that party. So both greed and what we call the need to political corruption for extraction, and as well political corruption for power preservation. So the people involved, they were employees of Credit Suisse in London, who were, finding the $2 billion. They were employees of the Privinvest shipbuilder based in Abu Dhabi, but with strong European connections. They came up with the idea that let's borrow $2 billion from the banks, and let's set up 3 fake companies in Mozambique, and then let's take the proceeds of the loans and distribute them widely. None of the 3 companies were ever operational, as far as I know. All the money was just evaporating. The third group of people involved were Mozambican politicians and senior ministerial office. And I'm here now in possession of a list of all the people because who received bribes. We know quite a lot about this now, because just this week was the end of a trial going on in New York, where the American FBI had gotten hold of one of the involved people from the Privinvest shipbuilder and accusing him for wire fraud in the US. He was actually acquitted, so unfortunately. So he's sort of off the hook. But in the process during the trial, he really spilled a lot of beans. And he came up with this, actually an Excel sheet of nicknames of all the Mozambican politicians who had received bribes in the size of millions of dollars. And those included, now he says, actually President Nyusi for his electoral campaign of 2014. The son, the guy who received most money was the son of the previous president, Armando Guebuza. And then there's a long list of politicians and senior businessmen, senior officials who have received millions of dollars. But this is just a tiny bit of the $2 billion, right? The rest was spread all across. Now, So this is how big the scandal was and how threatening it is. Now, what we do in this chapter is sort of rewinding and seeing how did it come to this. And rather than seeing the hidden debt scandal as an aberration or some kind of freak case, we see it as a symptom revealing systemic traits and as an epitome of a historical process. So just let me briefly outline that. Frelimo, the ruling party in Mozambique today, has been in power unabridged since 1975 when the country was independent from Portugal. After a long period, first 15 years, where Frelimo had installed itself as the only legal party in the country. This was a one-party state. And continuous civil war during that period. There was peace in 1990 or 1992, and the war came to an end, and the regime changed. They said, "Okay, we're no longer communists. We're no longer a one-party state. We're liberal Democrats, and we'll open for a multi-party system." Sounds all nice. Except that the system of the party state has kept on going to today. So it's not like they allowed for other parties to compete, but they never win elections, right? So Frelimo maintains all power, and it's the Frelimo state system that is distributing power and money and who gets what in the country, by and large. The conceptual, now what happened in the 1990s was that then President Khisa, he came across as sort of the liberalist guy. This was the heyday of neoliberalism, and the order of the day was privatization. It was, liberalization of the banking system, and the Frelimo elite really took advantage of this. They sort of, what Khisa regime ensured was that the Frelimo elite could enrich themselves by privatizing the values of the state or the state's resources into their own hands and pockets, so basically. And so they did. And with the banking scandals that came in the late 1990s, it turned out that all the Frelimo, lots of Frelimo politicians had borrowed money from the banks, which they never paid back, and they never intended to pay it back. That's how they got rich. So the Gubuza regime came across in 2005, his successor, changed things in a way, and that's where power preservation took center stage. I probably should end by now, yeah. In this clientelistic and rent-seeking economy, as you said also with the case of Uganda, access to economic opportunity is monopolized by the Frelimo party system, and to win political support, one must wield economic clout. Thus, if our analysis is correct, then one cannot be separate from the other. Personal enrichment is the way to secure political power, and political power is the way to secure personal enrichment. This is why these are so tied together. By and large, the presidency of Khisa until 2004 allowed corruption for an elite enrichment alone. Then Gubuza, after 2005, his regime was marked by a turn towards making use of corruption to secure political power for the party and the elite. And then in the end, to secure political power for Gubuza himself to get, and his particular faction, and in particular for his re-election campaign in 2014, that he incidentally did not succeed with. But then the damage had already been done, because we think that that's the main reason why the drive to secure these $2 billion came about, was the need to secure funding for his faction, so to say. when there was such short time, he had no time to wait for the resource boom in Mozambique, which was going on at the time, to sort of start producing results. Then they reverted to a simpler option, was that they could use the enormous known resources as a collateral upon which they could entice or justify that foreign banks, such as Credit Suisse, could borrow them that or loan them that much money. So again, we find that the secret loans affair is difficult to explain by greed alone, because political ambition and the need to secure large funding for patronage is so vital. Yeah, I think I could stop there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's what you said is astonishing. I mean, learning there is also an Excel file with the names and the amount of the bribes, so it's quite interesting. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Inge to present. He's the editor of the book, but he has written several chapters, and I'd like to invite you to talk about Nigeria and power extraction and preservation in Nigeria.
Yes, I wrote up this chapter on Nigeria together with Aslak Orre, who works at an NGO in Nigeria, and Professor Emmanuel Oyo, who is a political scientist at a university in Nigeria. So together we have plenty of stuff, and I can assure you we have plenty of stuff from Nigeria on corruption. We didn't really know where to begin. Nigeria has been at the top of this corruption perceptions index for many years, at the absolute top for several years, and it's still among the top 5 most corrupt countries in the world. And it has managed to be so for many years through military rule and also through civilian rule after.
Thanks.
And most of this can be explained by oil income. They have plenty of money to extract and to abuse and to distribute. So that's why the levels of corruption and political corruption is so extreme. Nigeria has had government revenues from the oil sector in the size of $40 to $50 billion a year over at least 25 years, even more. It's one of the top 10 oil producers in the world. They produce as much as Norway. They are competing with Angola to be the biggest producer in Africa. That goes a little bit up and down. So they have more or less the same oil income as Norway have had, and they have squandered it all completely. The economy of Nigeria is now as poor as it was in 1973, after all this oil money. 61% of Nigerians are living below the poverty level of $1 something, according to the World Bank. And this extreme poverty is actually increasing. And I just read that Nigeria now has more people below this poverty level than India has, in absolute numbers. And Nigeria is only a tenth of the population of India. So whereas India has been eradicating absolute poverty, Nigeria has been able to produce it and reproduce it. Still going on. So what happened to all this money? Has been squandered. Has been embezzled and squandered. Part of the history is that the natural resources of Nigeria have been depleted by foreign interests for 200 years. This goes on. Nigeria is being exploited terribly by international petroleum companies in particular. They earn a lot in Nigeria, and they are willing to go to lengths to secure their access to these natural resources. And they have always had a very willing political elite locally to let this happen, as long as this elite has gotten hold of a share of the revenues. And that has been sufficient to keep the system going for all these years. And that is really political corruption. When you have a ruling elite that allows this kind of exploitation to take place year after year after year. Capital flight from Nigeria, according to international statistics, is in the size of $10 billion a year. Money is pouring out of Nigeria, ending up in private property, real estate in London, in bank accounts in Switzerland and the US and all these tax havens. The rich Nigerians are flashing their wealth as good as they can. Just heard the story that British Airways flies once a day between London and Nigeria with an airplane with only business class in it. First and business class. Plenty of demand for that, and they spend a lot on tax-free in-flight sales that keeps this route very profitable. Suspicious consumption. The mechanisms by which this ruling elite has laid their hands on so much of the proceeds from oil is easy to understand. I have one example here, very recent example, still up in courts in various parts of the world. A former Minister of Petroleum in Nigeria, Daniel Etete, he created his private little oil company as a minister. And this private little oil company of his bought an offshore oil block from the Nigerian government for $2 million. OPL 245. Search for that and you will get the entire story. OPL 245. Point is that some years later, he sold this offshore oil block that he bought for $2 million. He sold it to Shell and the Italian company Eni for $1.3 billion. That's a good investment, I would think, but that's one of the ways they do it. And in our book chapter, we are also listing a number of other extraction methods. Military procurement, for instance, a lot comes from military procurement. They are siphoning off from the state budget on military quite a lot. They are propping it up with their own private companies that deliver substandard, subvaluable equipment for the military. And all these large infrastructure projects are also being siphoned off systematically. And you have the dead meat companies that I was talking about. You have a number of middlemen who are able to enrich themselves, middlemen between the government and the oil companies. Another nice little story involving the Norwegian oil company Statoil. Now it's called Equinor, yeah, right. When it was Statoil, they got a concession for drilling offshore, and there are not very many international oil companies that can drill offshore on that kind of deep waters that they have. So Equinor, Statoil got a license. But the problem is that when they started to drill, a man popped up and said, "Hey, I want 10% of everything you earn. I have a contract on that, because I managed to make Statoil gain this contract in the first place. I was the middleman, the broker who made the deal. And actually, according to this piece of paper, I'm entitled to 10% forever." And this was a government insider. So until the case came to court and settlement was reached, Statoil had to freeze all its operations in Nigeria. So this was an insider who wanted to get paid and had the system work for him. I think they had to pay him not 10%, but a good deal of money for him to shut up. So and then former minister in the government of Nigeria said that corruption isn't part of the government. It's the object of government. So that's an extractive part of it. Nigeria also has had some ingenuity in coming up with good methods of how to reinvest this money in staying in power. So they are buying friends, of course. They have done so for many, many years. They are buying parliamentary majorities, and they are buying actually the entire parliament of Nigeria by paying them more than any other parliamentarians in the world. They earn $40,000 a month, plus benefits, a lot of benefits. And one political scientist looked into what they were actually talking about in Parliament, in session. And a big chunk of the time was spent on discussing their benefits and their remunerations and the ways of how to expand on those. And there are also a large number of them. You have a 360-member House of Representatives, a 109-member Senate, and you have the 36 governors, and all of these people have villas in Abuja, the capital, where they meet, and servants and cars and security and all of that. There are entire areas around Abuja with the nicest villas you can think of to house all these people. And they are also manipulating elections. In the last elections in 2015, no, the next but last elections in 2015, 39 people were killed on election day and 800 in election-related violence prior to the elections. So the politicians who want to be elected, they do not only have to buy people to vote for them, they are also buying the Bakassi boys and other militants who are scaring people, frightening people into voting for them. That comes in addition to the vote buying. So the EU Election Observation Corps in 2007 said that these elections were the worst they had ever seen in any country in the world. They also buy themselves impunity. They buy up these institutions of oversight and control. The Anti-Corruption Commission of Nigeria and 2 and 3 other anti-corruption commissions have been put up, and they have been used systematically for political purposes rather than for anti-corruption. They have still not caught one big fish except for a few that belong to the oppositions or who were rivals to the people of the insiders. So this buying of violence, the militants and the thugs, is probably the worst excess of this power-preserving corruption problem in Nigeria. Makes the country violent in addition to being utterly corrupt from the top to the bottom.
Thank you very much, Inge.
I'm sorry to be so bleak and negative.
No, I'm sure we'll come with some
Yes.
pinky, rosy picture at some point with hopeful messages. We have to. But thank you very much to the three of you. That was very insightful. And I think what you depict is something that could be apply to other countries in the continent and in other regions. If I think of the region I know, Central Africa, I mean, when I read the chapters, I could relate to DRC, for example, the Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and Gabon. So I'd invite you to do more work in the Francophone countries as well. Maybe I can start with the first question. During your presentation right now, we heard about election and how funding can be used to buy votes. We heard about the loans and how they can also help to preserve power and extract more resources. And we heard also how extractive revenues can be used. In each of your country, what would you say is the favorite extractive method, and what would be the favorite power-preserving method? One. You have to choose one for each of your country. Inge, would you like to start?
In Nigeria, it is to put up a private business. That's what the politicians do. They put up a private business and then they give this business political favors. Loans, state contracts, guarantees, monopoly situations. That's the basic way of siphoning of the big money.
Okay. Moses?
That's I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. So you're asking for what's the best way to extract?
Yeah.
In Uganda, what would you say is the common, something you see in almost every sector or in the country?
Yeah. Well, I think the key and predominant way of extraction now is through procurement. So procurement corruption, because the government of Uganda in recent years has been so obsessed with large infrastructure projects, so road construction, dam construction, and other related projects that involve big money, and a lot of this money actually is now coming from Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank of China. Mm-hmm. So it's Chinese loans with Chinese contractors and Chinese workers as well, especially technical, but with the involvement of Ugandan middlemen, I guess, and women, but largely men, brokers who help Chinese companies to get contracts outside of competitive bidding, outside of the regular way of getting a government contract. And the way they do it is to go to the president himself and say, you know what, we're planning to do this dam or that road. The Chinese want to give us money to do the project. Mr. President, let's give the project to the Chinese because, first of all, they will give us the loan without any conditionalities, without, asking questions about, democracy, human rights, whatever, which is what Western sources of funding like the World Bank are going to be asking when they give loans. So you have middlemen who are connected to government or even work for government, including, senior government officials. They are involved in these big procurement cases because at the end of the day, the project bill is going to be overinflated. And it is inflated because the middlemen have to get a cut. They have to get a share of, of the money. So I would say I think that today is the biggest source. In the 90s, it used to be military procurement, military corruption. You had a lot of money for buying military jets, money for buying, food rations for the military, because the Ugandan military in the 90s was involved in, prosecuting counterinsurgency operations in northern Uganda against the rebels there. Military corruption, I think, still remains an important source, among other sources. But perhaps, infrastructure is now the topmost, because the Ugandan military is still involved in adventures in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Central African Republic, and there's a lot of money coming from the EU, from the US, to fund the Ugandan military to fight, wars that otherwise the US would be fighting. So there's a lot of, foreign military aid, which contributes towards providing the avenues for extraction and for regime preservation as well. And I would say that both infrastructure procurement corruption and military procurement corruption both serve extractive purposes and regime preservation purposes. Yeah.
Okay. What about Mozambique? What would you say? Is it similar or is it different?
No, I'd say it was very similar to the ways that Moses described for Uganda. Let me try to give you one example, and also perhaps just put it a little bit more schematically. So the way to extract resources in Mozambique would be you use your membership in the ruling party to get access to positions of public power in the state or the local governance system somehow. And then from there, you are in charge of distributing resources in terms of licenses for extracting resources from the earth, or you're in terms of usage of space or buildings or whatever, or you are in charge of some small part of the public budget from which you do public procurement, and you take a share of that in the process of procuring goods. So you use your party membership, get access to public power, and use that to extract. That's the schematic way of doing it. And repeat and repeat. So just to give you one example, in the faction, or the strong part of the faction of the current presidency of Mozambique, around Filipe Nyusi, who is the current president. He's from the very northern province of Mozambique called Cabo Delgado. In that province, some 12 years ago, they found huge deposits of minerals and valuable stones, such as rubies. When they found those, there was a rush of people, garimpeiros, as they say in Mozambique, coming from Tanzania, from Mozambique, from other African countries as well. They're mostly young men, adventurers who want to go to the ruby mining areas and see if they can take part in the digging and shoving of the earth, and see if they can find a few rubies and get out and sell those for, let's say, $5,000. So there are thousands of kids trying to do this. Now, a few years later on, these kids, they start spending lavishly on the local market. These guys get rich, these kids, let's say that, right? And they're poor people getting kids, and they're rich, and they spend. And then there are some people in the political system who don't like this. And now, incidentally, they managed to use state resources to sort of circle around these mining areas, kick out all the kids, and make sure that private companies with proper security from South African security companies and so on, get in and get in charge of the extraction of the valuable rupees. Who are the owners of these companies? Guess once. Senior politicians around the current president. So this is how it goes on. So they want to get the values out of that, rather than these thousands of kids.
What I notice is that these all three countries, I mean, Nigeria, Uganda, and Mozambique, what they have also in common is that they are resource-rich countries. Nigeria has been an oil country for many, many years. Uganda is the last couple of years, and Mozambique, it's more recent with the gas they found. probably the answer is already yes to the question, but I still ask it. So would you say that the revenues coming from these resources affect this political corruption and power extraction preservation? And can we get lessons learned for Mozambique, for example? Because Mozambique is maybe newer, maybe there are some lessons, and can we do that? Can we prevent it? Or do we see new trends? I don't know if the Nigeria experience want to start.
Yeah, but I want to go very far from African natural resource producing countries to Costa Rica. Costa Rica has probably oil and gas deposits as their neighbors have. It's the same geology. Costa Rica recently said no thank you to various approaches by multinational oil companies to extract and export. They said we have...
You turn on your mic.
We have a rainforest to take care of. We have a tourism business to take care of. We have fisheries to take care of. And we do not have the institutions to properly regulate an oil business. So no, thank you. In my experience, this doesn't happen in Africa. They run for it, and they even borrow a lot of money on future prospects of earnings from it. And that has happened a lot.
So for Uganda has not exactly been a natural resource dependent economy. It's an agricultural economy, and for a long time the major source of forex for Uganda was actually coffee exports. In more recent years, it's actually been foreign remittances, financial transfers coming from Ugandans abroad. But the country now is primarily for being an oil producer. The oil hasn't yet started coming out of the ground. And for me as a Ugandan, I wish it doesn't come out for the next 50 years until there. And what Costa Rica is doing is precisely what a country like Uganda needs to do, to say, hey, wait a minute, we're not ready for managing, oil exploration because we don't have the institutional mechanisms in place to deal with a natural resource called oil. But for Uganda, for a long time, actually, and we were talking about this earlier about, what are the major sources of rent for poor countries? Say the natural resources or foreign aid. For Uganda, it was the latter for a long time. For a long time, Uganda was the leading African darling of the West, and so a lot of foreign aid flows kept pouring in Uganda, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, and that was a big source of resources that ended up being stolen and being embezzled or misappropriated. I detail some of those in the chapter on Uganda. Donor money meant for health programs. For example, there was a big grant from Western donors aimed at vaccination. By the Global Fund. It was a big Global Fund money that was actually stolen big time. There was a fund for combating HIV and malaria and tuberculosis. That was also, a big source of embezzlement by officials in the Ministry of Health. So I mean, in recent years, Western donors haven't been giving a lot of money to Uganda. Actually, many countries did cut their foreign aid commitments to Uganda. And now, the Ugandan president has shifted his focus on getting money from China and Chinese money. I think there's aid money that comes from China, but the bulk of it is actually loans, long-term loans, which are actually a lot more expensive than traditional Western loans. And then, and then now there is also turning to getting oil money.
Yeah.
Even though oil hasn't yet come out of the ground, the Ugandan government has been getting oil money by way of royalties
Royalty
and
taxation maybe as well.
and capital gains taxation.
Yes.
When different companies have been selling farm down, and then the government assesses taxation. In fact, there was a big dispute over taxing tallow oil for selling its stake to another multinational corporation. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Aslak, maybe
Yeah,
what do you see in Mozambique with the new discovery of gas, and you already see some extraction and preservation related to the revenues, or maybe not revenues yet, I don't know.
yeah. There's so many things I would like to say in relation to this, but I wanted to really thank you, Moses, for saying this, giving us this idea about Uganda. Then maybe it's better that they don't develop the petroleum resources. Maybe it's better that they stay in the ground for now, at least. And I'm really trying to develop this argument in the case of Mozambique. Although for me as a Norwegian national, coming from a major gas and petroleum producing country, it's sort of hard to say that we can do it here, but then the poor African countries shouldn't do it, so that we get all the profits, right? It doesn't sound really well, but this is really for the benefit of Mozambique.
Yeah.
I'm academically and personally convinced that it would be to the benefit of Mozambicans not to start this sort of gas adventure after they found Africa's biggest gas deposits outside of northern Mozambique at the end of 2010. It would probably be... There are so many risks involved in this that Mozambique could develop a fully fledged resource curse and all the associated evils that comes with that. Or rather an oil curse even.
Yeah.
Is it impossible that Mozambique develops its resources and uses it to benefit the population and creates a system of more increased welfare for the population and so on? No. Of course, it's not impossible, but it's rather unlikely if you look at the profile of the country. There aren't many other cases of countries who have made discoveries of oil and developed it to the benefit of the population. It rather tends to go in the direction of the resource curse. It's possible if Mozambique did all the things we know, sort of in the book, about how you should best manage the oil resources. If they used every available information and did everything right from now on, then it's possible. But on the contrary, what we see Mozambique has done since they started resource extraction is rather than they're doing everything wrong in the book. So, better leave it in the ground, I think. And then I wanted to come with one anecdote about the possibility of learning from the other countries. I can't recall her name, but the previous finance minister of Nigeria, what can you recall?
Ezekweli.
No, the woman, Iwela.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Anyways, the previous finance minister of Nigeria, she wrote a book about her sort of her memoirs, and she tells an interesting anecdote in that book where sometime around 2013 she was approached by some Lebanese businessmen coming from a Middle East company offering her and the minister or the government a quite favorable deal where somehow miraculously they would get access to huge loans, but it wouldn't add to the national debt, But there would be opportunities for private enrichment and so on for some of the ministers and whatnot. And she recalls this meeting where the government was unified, and this also involved some of the security sector bosses and so on. They were all for it. Yeah, this sounds great. Let's go for this. They say it won't even indebt the country, but we will get access to all these resources. You know, how could that be? And then she comes in as a finance minister and she says, no, I won't have it. There's no way this, if it looks too good to be true, then it probably isn't true, you know? And she says, no. And it turns out that these people, the Lebanese businessmen who came, were the very same who were the responsible for this huge fraud in Mozambique. Meaning, Mozambicans, they took the bait, but the Nigerians, or in that case, managed to resist and say no. So I don't know particularly the profile of the rest of her political activity, but at least in this case, it showed that it was possible to resist the temptations coming from the greedy businessmen in the north and in the west with access to huge capital. It's possible to resist it. So, but the Mozambicans didn't, unfortunately.
Thank you.
I know about her. She was even here once.
Yeah.
She wanted to stand for president, but she couldn't raise enough money.
Yeah.
So she threw in the
But,
handkerchief at some point. She didn't get sufficient private sector backers for her bid for the presidency.
well, she had the Lebanese. They were offering all kinds of.
Was it because you didn't have a godfather? I think that's
Yeah.
a concept you used.
Yeah.
And I learned it. I don't know if maybe you can both tell us if you also have a similar concept. Maybe before I ask you, you can explain the audience about the godfatherism.
This has to do with interlinkages between business and politics. I think in the early days of independence of most African countries, the trajectory was that people went into politics and big politics, and from there established a company profile for themselves. I mean, went into private businesses using the political clout to gain access to preferential treatment and establish their own businesses. Now we see a lot of people going the other way around, from big business and into politics. But in Nigeria, you have these big industrialists called big men, or power brokers in many ways, godfathers, who will not themselves go into politics, but they will hire someone to do it for them. So they will back some candidates and finance their campaigns so that they get elected. And then they will collect their returns. They will get the preferential treatment for the businesses, etc. So it's kind of an indirect way of investing in politics to safeguard your business. And I think that is something we should discuss. To what extent are people now moving from business into politics? Business using corrupt ways to buy their ways into political favorable decisions and frameworks and tax regimes and access to government contracts and all that. And to what extent is it the other way around? Because that has a lot to say of where we should also put in the emphasis of any anti-corruption efforts, right? It depends. And in my impression, most of these politicians have enriched themselves sufficiently, and relatively independent big businesses have been established. And especially in Nigeria, that is such a big economy, they do have private businesses not created by politicians, but now being able to use their clout, economic clout, to get into politics to protect their businesses that way.
I think there's also a trend we see in Europe where you have oligarchs going into parties and then politics. Do you see that also in Mozambique? Is it a common trait, also characteristic in Mozambique, or not at all? You don't have this businessmen backing up politicians and then a sort of godfather godson relationship.
It's in Mozambique. There is a central feature of the society is that there is no independent class of oligarchs or business class outside of the ruling party.
Okay.
So there is no way really, and that's incidentally one of the major points in our article or our chapter, that it's hard to separate the business elite and the political elite. How to find a rich businessman who is not member of the Frelimo ruling party.
Okay.
Or the son of or daughter of one of the dignitaries.
Yes. Yeah.
What struck me also when I read the book is especially in Uganda and Nigeria, you mentioned the role of oversight bodies, for example, in the parliament, committees within the parliament investigating, or in Nigeria there are many different anti-corruption commissions or investigation bodies, but at the same time it feels like they are kind of infiltrated by political power. Is that the case? Like they are being used and maybe abused by the political elite, ruling elite, to keep this and capture these bodies? And if so, what can we do? How to overcome this influence?
One of the favorite committees of the Nigerian parliament is this, what did they call it? But they have the responsibility of doing the big public procurements. I mean, they're making decisions.
Public Accounts Committee.
Public Accounts Committee, yeah. Public Accounts Committee. That's where everybody wants to be, because from there they get the insight into what is coming up in terms of big government infrastructure projects and purchases. So that's a nice place to be, because that can position your business very favorably if you get first-hand information on that.
Sure. Moses?
Yeah, so, one of the things that you get in conditions where institutions are weak and underdeveloped is that those institutions, democratic institutions, become tools of either putting up a show, putting up a facade, or even they become ensnared and such that their theoretical reason for being there becomes highly compromised. So what you see in a country like Uganda is that you have these so many investigatory and prosecutorial institutions and agencies. The Inspectorate of Government, which is the government ombudsman, the Criminal Investigations Department of the Police Force, the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament, the Auditor General, who is this very powerful public institution charged with auditing all government bodies and ministries and agencies. In recent years, the president has created an anti-corruption unit in State House. So many of them. Now the thing is, the irony, the paradox is that the more the proliferation of these bodies, the more corruption you get. Okay. What does that tell us? That it tells us that these bodies, in due course of time, in fact become ways through which corruption is regularized and routinized, because whenever there is any corruption allegation, that body is called on to investigate. and it investigates superficially and, does ABCD, a report is written, and either it never, sees the light of the day, or even when the report is published, the culprits actually never get punished. Okay, and so, nothing happens, and we move on, right? So this is, a common phenomenon you'll find in a country where political corruption is part of the technology of rule and part of the way that the system actually operates. You'll have these, democratic and rule of law institutions, even the judiciary. In Uganda, the judiciary is supposed to be a very well-established and functioning institution. There's even an anti-corruption court. There's a division of the High Court which is specifically for handling corruption cases. People are taken there and they are acquitted. Or, once the case is there, the government will lose interest in the case and the prosecution won't be concluded.
Thank you. I think we'll soon open the floor for questions, but I'd like to maybe end our discussion with a bit of a provocative question. In the conclusion of the book, you have an interesting sentence, and you kind of started with that earlier in your opening remarks, and I think for some might not be agree with it. And I quote the sentence: "Political corruption in the form of greed and personal enrichment is not too difficult to curb. If so, why are we still here? Why am I not in the mountain in France taking care of the sheep?" Could you tell us why you say it's not too difficult to curb, and could we maybe discuss a bit what are the options and what we could do?
That's in the context of bureaucratic or administrative corruption, isn't it? That's,
the conclusion,
yeah.
It's the last sentence of the book. It ends with this statement.
I've got to see what I was thinking. Maybe some of the others can
but we haven't really, in general, we haven't really talked about what we can do with your research. So you lay down the problem very specifically. It's well detailed. And I know it's important to state the problem at stake. Do you have any
I think that generally there are lots of things you could do to curb greed and the possibilities for using greed as a way of extracting resources through corrupt actions. If there is only political will in a reasonably strong and autonomous state. Yeah. The problem is with political corruption that if the system is set up in such a way as though political corruption is needed to preserve power, then it's systematically undermining political will to do anything about corruption, whether grand corruption or petty administrative corruption. So this is sort of that's the conundrum, You cannot. How do you control the controllers, so to say? It comes back to this question, I think.
I'm back in the loop. I know what I was saying when I can make it clear. Now the point is that when corruption takes the form of pure greed, when certain politicians and top-level bureaucrats, presidents, do extract money for their personal enrichment only, that is something that can endanger the regime, the other insiders, be a nuisance, really a problem for the ruling party. And these kind of people, if they are individual enrichment kind of people, you can get rid of them. Just think about South Africa and Jakub Zuma. That's where this idea comes from. Jakub Zuma, all he did in terms of political corruption was self-enrichment. He did very little to safeguard his power position by this money. He was more about flashing his wealth, building his compound.
Personal accumulation.
Personal accumulation. He didn't have the guts, I would say, to reinvest in his power position. And therefore the party could, in the end, kick him out because he was such a nuisance in order to preserve the power of the party, which they managed to do. But when people reinvest in their power positions, they are much harder to get rid of.
I wanted to just add one example real quick of Singapore. If you read Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, he had to deal with corruption in a very hard-nosed manner. And he writes about one very, penetrating case of his brother-in-law, who I forget the name, but who was a minister. So he had a brother-in-law who was a minister in his government. So Lee Kuan Yew established this Economic Crimes Investigations Bureau, which was, the frontline agency charged with, cracking down on corruption and dealing with grand, cases. So his brother-in-law was accused of having taken a bribe, a hefty bribe, I don't know, like $200,000. When the Economic Crimes Investigations Bureau was in the course of, getting hold of him, and as the evidence, sort of got together and they were closing in on him, he ran to Lee Kuan Yew and claimed that all this was politically motivated by some other people, which is the standard, fallback position by many, especially political actors, when they are being accused of wrongdoing, engaging in corruption. They'll say it is political. Somebody is witch hunting me, and
sometimes.
Yeah, which might be true sometimes. So, but this guy runs to Lee Kuan Yew, and Lee Kuan Yew says, you know what? Actually, there's nothing I can do about that. Because he was claiming he was innocent. Lee Kuan Yew told him, if you are innocent, you'll be cleared. Just easy. If you know you have done nothing wrong, just relax. I trust those guys who are doing the job. They are professionals. They are not politicians. If you are innocent, they are going to clear you. But this guy knew he wasn't innocent. You know what he did? He committed suicide. He committed suicide and left a suicide note apologizing to Lee Kuan Yew and saying, I'm sorry, I did all this stuff. What I was being accused of, it is true, I did it. And I have decided to take the ultimate price by killing myself. That's how Lee Kuan Yew fought corruption in Singapore. You are fingered, you have to answer. There is nothing like you are running to me such that I give you cover, even if you are my family relative. Because this was his brother-in-law. And he told him, I can't do anything, I cannot interfere. So many of if you go to a country like Uganda, the corruption at the top is such that whoever is heavily involved has cover in State House. Okay, goes to the president, and the president is...
Maybe they have to go to be ambassador at some country a bit far away for a while, or...
Maybe, sorry to interrupt, maybe I can open
Sure.
There are only a couple of minutes left. Do we have a queue for the catch box for questions? Yes.
How to put
in front,
the front.
please? Yes. Thank you.
I like that.
First, a personal confession. I came down to spend 10 minutes here, and then I was going to go up and continue my paper on Angola, and you kept me for an hour and a half. So that's a compliment to the panel. I think this was an excellent panel, 3 very, very interesting cases. I have 3 quick questions. First of all, Inge, can you just show me the front of the book, and then tell me what other chapters we can delve into, in addition to the 3 that you've mentioned, or the ones that have been discussed here? That's one. My second question is, have you investigated the correlation between corruption and party type or state type across the world? Because it seems to me like all these examples are examples of really strong one-party states, or at least, maybe some kind of democracy, but with one party in power. So how does that facilitate corruption? If you look at the world writ large. You mentioned the example of Costa Rica. Costa Rica, multi-party democracy, no military, dispersion of power. So it's like a totally different context. So I guess my main question is, how does the level of corruption link up to party politics plus resources? Because you've been talking about extractive industries in particular, right? But how does it link up with the party structures?
Thank you.
That's it.
Big question.
Do you want to respond now, or shall we take another question before?
Maybe we should
I think-
answer quickly
Sure.
before we forget it. How it links up. We have seen from much corruption research that when a country democratizes, the levels of corruption goes up significantly for quite some time, because to hold elections is costly. To win elections is costly. And some countries seem now to be stuck in that situation of high-cost elections in which they are willing to invest whatever, all they can find, because also the returns are so high of being in office, of winning office. In countries where there is little else, either you are in government and that makes you rich, or you're out. And another point is that we need to do more research into the link between politics and business. I have just said a few words about the trends that I might see. That people are now moving from business into politics rather than the other way around. But it has a lot to do of the characteristics of the regimes. Some regimes are more military-based, some are based on the ruling party, some are based more on the civil service kind of. Some have a regional or ethnic background, and all this matters, but we don't really know how. About the chapters,
Other cases.
we have South Africa on the Zuma case, enrichment, and how the regime fought back. We have on Malawi,
Yep.
on the financing of political parties, especially, and handouts.
Ghana.
And we have Ghana, as been mentioned, and we have Kenya. And on the big men.
I would say something, but maybe we
Very-
take
yeah, because
another.
we have 5
because of
minutes.
time,
Yes.
Let's take another.
Please go ahead.
No. My question is just out of curiosity. Inge, you said that Nigeria has been exploited for 200 years by Western companies. For amusement, one could ask if there are any plans to change that. But my question is, how is this seen compared to the Chinese investments nowadays? Are they are they compared? Are they just as exploitative, or how is that? If you have
My simple answer to
be-
that would be yes.
Before you respond, is there anyone else that'd like to ask a question?
Yeah. And then we can answer.
You have.
I just forgot to congratulate you on the book.
Takes that off.
So maybe you can respond to the question, and at the same time make some concluding remarks, if it's okay with you. Do you want to start, Inge?
Will Nigeria be exploited also for the next 200 years?
By the Chinese this time. I would say yes.
By the Western world, I don't think so. I think the oil era has come to an end. We are talking about peak oil. We are talking about other energy sources that will take over, and oil in Nigeria is more expensive to produce than in Saudi Arabia, for instance. So when demand goes down and prices go down because of alternative energies, Nigeria will be out. Saudi Arabia will be in for quite some time and pick up the rest of the market because they can produce so cheaply. It seems that China is in for the long term, developing countries slightly different. The Chinese model, traditional industrialization, and in addition to resource extraction. Look at all the infrastructure investments they are doing. Sort of a rip-off also, but we don't know yet. I don't know. China is not my...
Moses, some concluding words? Maybe you want to start
Yeah,
from China? You're saying yes, definitely.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that, the Chinese are involved in as, extractive and whatever you want to call it, ways of engaging with Africa as traditional Western companies have in the past. So I don't see them, I think they're even capable of being worse. But by way of conclusion, just wanted to respond to her question earlier about the relationship between party system type or party or state type and corruption. There's definitely a very important link there, a very important relationship there. Some of these cases we have analyzed are cases of, single dominant party systems, but which have a lot of factionalism, a lot of internal contestations within the ruling party, within the single dominant ruling party. If you look at other African cases where, and I guess even outside of Africa, where there is less factional struggles within the dominant party, there is bound to be less corruption, because it means there is more control and more discipline than where you have a lot of factionalism, such that, different outside actors are connected to different factions, and so the corruption is kind of like spread out. The other thing I would say, and for me as a political scientist, is that, and Inge here, the nature of the state definitely has implications for the nature of corruption. Where you have state fragmentation and state weakness, it means that individuals are more powerful than the state and can do whatever they want. They can engage in all these financial malfeasance, and there is limited accountability. So there is definitely a very important positive correlation between state fragmentation and the extent of corruption.
Yeah, sometimes governments have to buy various factions, give them their turfs, because they are strong enough to keep them or demand them. So they have to be bought off. And that is very costly in terms of corruption. Just look at Afghanistan, where all these warlords have to be accommodated by having a ministry that they can extract from.
And Nigeria.
And Nigeria.
Aslak, some words as well? Maybe reactions with the questions and what Inge Moses said?
Because I wanted to revert to your question, Per, because your question about China is interesting, mostly because continues to be this fascination with China in Africa, and the question of the huge influx of Chinese businesses and people to China. But from what I can observe in the countries I know best, which is Mozambique and Angola, on the other side, the Chinese activity follows a rather similar pattern. No, it's not true that the Chinese come to Mozambique and Angola to extract things, its natural resources. That's often the claim that they are coming to do. And yes, there are some in Mozambique, for instance, they call it the Chinese takeaway, which is an accusation that the Chinese companies are taking away tropical timber and export it illegally to China, in association with corrupt politicians in Mozambique who sort of close their eyes so that the Chinese can export the timber without paying, taxes. But most of what the Chinese companies do is that they actually let Western companies take care of the major natural resource extraction, be it oil, gas, or coal, or the huge industrial enterprises that are needed in order to carry out these activities, particularly in the petroleum business. That's being done by Western companies. And that creates, in turn, a quite significant income to the local African state, which is where the Chinese come in. Now, with all this new income, these African states have the financing to set up to procure public stuff for the state, or public infrastructure, particularly infrastructure. That's where the Chinese come in. They build stuff, and they sell stuff. New equipment for this and that, cars and computers and whatnot built in China. All this stuff, but they come in at the point where it's in the downstream part, but upstream part is still the Western companies taking care. So rather than taking away, the Chinese are bringing stuff. What they're taking away are, of course, monetary profits, but some of that also stays in the hands of a few in Africa. So I think it's important to be sort of clear about how this game of what change. It's not like the Chinese brings corruption to Africa as if the Western companies were any better. I don't believe in that. Rather, it creates more competition, which for the benefit of the African elites who control the state resources to distribute, right? So that there are more bidders of bribes, so to say. That's sort of the idea I have in my head, at least. So it's not that the Chinese are doing things very differently.
Right. I'm sorry, I think I have to stop. It's already a bit late. So thank you so much. I think we can applaud for the release of the book. It's a very, very interesting book, and I hope you will read it. Thank you so much for the discussion. That was really interesting. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you a very nice afternoon in sunny Bergen.
Thank you.
Won't you display the book for people to
Yes, you should.
photographs? I think we should. I think she should come and take a photo.
By the way, the book matches your shirt.
Oh, Inge, I think she should take a photo with us with the book for her. And
Or should I take it with my phone?
take with your phone. I'll give you my iPad too. I think I'm done with this. Oops.
Come for a picture.
But I didn't do anything.
You did a great job. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Should I take it with your iPad?
Yes, with my iPad. Sophie, don't go.
No, I'm gonna stay here.
Not yet.
Not released yet.
It can be one.
You are the boss of the book.
Yep, turn out nice.
Okay.
Okay.
In a lot of fathers, there's only one mother in here. Only one.
That's not very gender balanced.
No,
It's not.
it's very difficult though to.